Hey guys, it's Jessica, and today I want to go over The Colony or The Tides. This movie came out earlier in 2021. It's something that came up on my radar when I was researching different fantasy and science fiction releases this year that I could review, watch, discuss, maybe enjoy. The elevator pitch for this movie is set in the distant future. A female astronaut shipwrecked on a long decimated Earth must decide the fate of the wasteland's remaining populace. This one kind of appealed to me right away. I liked the recolonization aspect. It reminds me a little bit of WALL-E, and I also like the fact that it's going to be a strong female protagonist. For me, that was really enough. I didn't check out any trailers, and I didn't look for more information. I just jumped right into the movie. I really like the title. Both The Colony and its original The Tides are great titles for this movie. I think I personally would have preferred if the movie had been called The Tides across the board. I think it's a more fitting and slightly more ambiguous title for the movie than The Colony ends up being. For those who don't know, this is a German movie. It is filmed in English, but it has a German director and writer. So some of the ideas and concepts, I'm not 100% settled on what they were supposed to be. The idea of calling something the colony or colonizing something has history and weight, specifically I think for American and British culture, that it might not for other places in the world. And it immediately makes me to address and interact with our cruelty to indigenous people, both historically and still ongoing today. And it's really hard for me then to watch this movie where a bunch of rich elites escaped Earth, abandoned everyone else to die, and then come back to try to retake over Earth when they run into an issue in their new colony. It's so directly to some of the colonialization issues that we can see in our own history, especially with the title of A Colony, not to take that lens to it and hyper-focus on those elements of the plot. But once I learned that this was a German film, I did a little bit more research and I learned the original name was The Tides. I actually wondered if it was supposed to be a more ambiguous film and there were actually thematically some different things I should have been looking at. Like I was wondering if The Tides is more a reflection on German society than I was really giving it credit for, and I'm not an expert in German society or where they are headspace-wise or what major themes were for them. So this is all very speculative and should be taken with a grain of salt. But one thing that stuck out to me once I knew that it was a German film is if you replace the rich people / the Kepler people's refrain for the many with for the fatherland, you have perhaps a direct one-for-one comparison to explore the emotional, mental headspace of an average citizen in Germany during World War II. Some of the things the Kepler people do for the many is sort of the same nationalistic refrain, self-sacrifice, but also hurting people around them or hurting people different than them that we could see play out in World War II. Even the whole fertility, perpetuating the human race themes that are within this movie have a different feeling to them if I incorporate them into like a World War II rhetoric. I know I've talked a couple times about how like specific breeding programs for humans or sentient beings that I find in fantasy and science fiction are worrying because it echoes some of the nationalistic elements that you can see in like a Nazi propaganda. Very interesting for me to see this sort of exploring that idea, pushing it, and like trying to ask what an average person would think or how an average person might come to these conclusions. Especially here in this movie where it seems like both the people from Kepler and the people who survived on Earth are white, and there's no real difference except for the people in Kepler were rich enough to leave Earth and these people were not and were somehow resilient enough to survive in a planet that they thought couldn't sustain life. Why are the Keplerians superior inherently? Is it because they've held on to this knowledge? And if that's the reason, then there's no genetic reason to support Keplerians over Earthlings. Another thing I thought would be great about this movie is it did have a female lead. You know, I saw Voyagers earlier this year, and I saw Reminiscence, and of course I've recently seen Dune, and none of these movies have a female lead, even though they're set in like a sci-fi space area. And actually, I think all three of these movies are sort of sexist in different ways. ways and sort of put women within a box or make them subservient to men. And there's not really that many science fiction movies that are led by women in general. Another thing I liked about this movie is conceptually, I like the idea of reclaiming the Earth. At this point in time, global warming has gone so far and it doesn't look like we're going to do anything about it. I've sort of accepted that we as a society are not going to preserve the planet for future generations in a way that would matter to me. And because of that, I'm looking for stories where we escape huge environmental impacts through the stars or underground or however, and then we come back later to reclaim this space. The fact that I found out later when watching the movie it was rich people reclaiming the Earth from poor people kind of puts a damper on it. But going into the movie, I liked the concept. And then another thing I liked in the movie is the for the many refrain. I do think there's a lot of interesting elements that we could weave into that. Its actual execution is a little bit clumsy and unsubtle at times. The fact that our good character's main refrain is for the many sort of telegraphs they're the bad guy. I haven't seen a movie where people doing the thing for the many and saying it like that out loud all the time has been a good sign. Usually, if you justify actions that are otherwise painful or horrible by saying for the many, it means immediately you're the bad guy. But it's still, at the end of the day, an interesting question. Do the ends justify the means? And who do you side with? Who is the many? What does that mean for the individual? When is it okay to sacrifice for a larger group? And when is that sacrifice asking too much? And especially in a contained thing like a movie where there's time-sensitive elements and all these other things that we're exploring, it can be a lot of fun to watch that play out on the big screen. I know some of the things I didn't care for are going to be huge pulls for other people. So for example, I didn't like the filming style. I know the cool color palettes and the shots and all that stuff were executed really well. And in fact, when I went and did some research on this movie, the effects here are practical. They shot in a place in Germany where the tides actually do come in and completely wash away all of the land, which is interesting to know that there's a location like this in the world. So it creates more sense that this could be a real place. But even knowing that the effects are practical and they all look really great, I just didn't like this world they portrayed. I didn't like the cold color palette. I didn't like how desperate it was. And I had some questions about the world itself, like why people were living specifically here, that just I don't feel panned out. It was interesting to see. And when the movie was called The Tides, it was a nice visual to go with some of the other symbolic elements that the tides was alluding to. As it stands now, where it's called The Colony, it makes less sense and it's not something that was visually enjoyable. Another thing that was pretty meh for me is the whole premise. The fact that the Kepler people were just living it up and then suddenly they went infertile and they couldn't have kids. And there's this urgency to reproduce and continue the human line. Just doesn't interest me. I don't feel inherently a sense of urgency or a sense of gripping interest in that premise. And I don't think the movie did a good job selling it to me. The woman who's leading the exposition, it doesn't seem like she wants to have children. So it doesn't even seem like her not being able to have kids invests her. Spoilers, I guess, starting right here. But later she meets the first crew that had come down to try and colonize the planet, and the kind of leader guy who is sort of taking things over and helping to terraform the Earth. He's really invested in repopulating the Earth and the Kepler people taking over the Earth, but he doesn't personally seem to want to have any children of his own. So that was interesting to me that he was so obsessed with finding a way for Kepler people to have children, but he personally didn't seem to want to have any kids of his own. That was just a weird thing about him. And he doesn't treat children of Kepler really well. They do have a child. His parentage is someone from Kepler, and he doesn't treat that child very well. He's deeply impatient with him. Is this a situation where we're seeing that the infertility has actually led to people not knowing how to deal with children? And then when the Kepler people come down and they see that humans are still living on Earth and seem to be repopulating just fine, it no longer becomes about sustaining the human race. It becomes about sustaining the Kepler society, which I don't necessarily know why you would care about. I just don't have that deep connection where I feel the need to continue some element of my line or my culture in that way. I don't have to have children to bring that culture in. So like the Kepler people, if some of them wanted to come down to Earth, help the other people who are already here, they could do all of that without having children of their own. So just this biological drive. I don't know, I don't connect to it at all. Plus, I think about what the one leader was saying. By the time Kepler women get down to Earth and regain their fertility, most of them are going to be 40 or 50, which is past their ability to have children. And I think like they've been going about how to solve the infertility problem all wrong. If they could create these spaceships and colonize other places, why can't they create test tube babies or some kind of hybrid womb situation? It seems to me like researching or waiting for it to be safe for them to return to, sending someone down to check that out, having them not respond, sending a second group down. All of this is like a lot of effort and money and resource that is like a side way to come at the problem. And for me, the colonization aspect is kind of meh. There are ways that we could discuss it that would be new and interesting to me, but this movie doesn't really do that. It basically just hammers in that colonialization is bad, that people who come in from someplace else where people are already occupying land do terrible things to the natives. I don't understand why we're still having this conversation from the colonizer's perspective. I already know this perspective. I already know this perspective is bad. I've already seen this perspective portrayed as like the hero and then come to find out they're the villain, or even worse when they're just portrayed as the straight hero the whole time. Something you see a lot in science fiction and fantasy specifically is just sort of like,
so many people have been here before. Why are we doing this again now?
It's implied that the decisions our female protagonist makes are good for the native people or help the native people or at least give the native people some kind of fighting chance. But I want to see a story where they all work together and the native people get some more agency and ability. I do think the movie tried to do this. There is a strong female character among the native people here, and she has been fighting this war against the Kepler people. She did start a revolution. She is really fierce and dedicated to her family. I'm just saying, maybe they picked the wrong protagonist, or maybe if they could have better centered that both of these women were protagonists, it would have been better. And then for me, the whole rich versus poor dichotomy kind of sucked. It was so unnuanced and so repetitive and dumb and things we'd seen a million times before. I think some people are going to like the rich versus poor dichotomy just because they always like that. I get it. I get beating that drum over and over again. But at the same time, it was done in an unsubtle, uninteresting way. The world building, not great. I know the shots were meant to set immersion and just put you in the place, but I just had so many questions that didn't feel answered. One of my primary issues is how in the future are we? Like, I get that the rich people vacated Earth after an environmental catastrophe and have been living on another planet for a while. When did their infertility issues start cropping up? How long have they been fighting that? How long have the people of Earth who stayed behind been sort of foraging and stuff? Because when they return to Earth, the native people of Earth are speaking a completely different mishmash of languages. That would have taken so many hundreds of years to set up to speak a completely different language. So that seems like generations and generations and generations of people. But at the flip side, over in Kepler, if it had been so many generations gone by, they would have noticed this slow creep in infertility. They should have been able to fix this without having to come back to Earth. These two things don't match. Also, if it's been so long that people can create their own language, how is travel going on in this time? How is there still gasoline? And we're clearly at a point where people can't refine gas anymore. There's just like a lot of things in the world that shouldn't still exist if it's been that many generations. And if it hasn't been that many generations, this language thing shouldn't be going on. I just found it perplexing. Like, how did the world I'm looking at coming to be? And I know that this movie had to tackle a lot. They had to establish a environmental tragedy, people escaping, people coming back. There was a lot going on they had to set up. And they had to set like a little bit of that Kepler society too to make this whole thing make sense. Even though they had a lot they had to do in an hour and a half, that doesn't excuse a poor execution at certain points. And especially where my brain was just so caught up on like,
how is what I'm seeing happen?
That is distracting me from enjoying the journey. Then to me, the world world building wasn't executed appropriately. The pacing in this movie was not great. I think the issue is the movie doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it an exploration movie? Is it a thriller? Is it a war movie? Is it a colonial movie? What is going on here? I came to this movie expecting us to be exploring the Earth. We come to find out that it is habitable, like right away, because the Earthlings come and capture our two landing crew members. Then I thought like it would be like more a sociological exploration and a communication between two peoples. But that's not really what this movie is. It's not quite a thriller. The pacing on that isn't fast enough. It's not like a high tension situation, although there are tense moments. It's not even really clear to me what each of these characters wanted. And because I don't know what the characters want, what their larger goals is, what kind of timeline is going on here, the movie lacks that focus and that intention going forward and driving it. For example, there's this young girl, Mila. She is stolen from her village, and it feels like there should be a lot of tense urgency. Like, retrieving Mila is very time sensitive, but the characters don't seem to treat it that way. They stop and they talk and they sip water, and then they finally find her and they try to get her in a way that also doesn't feel like there's any kind of sense of urgency or drive to get her. And even when our main protagonist ends up with Mila, she doesn't seem to feel any sense of need or push to connect with Mila, to talk to her, to comfort her, to get her out of there, to find out if getting out of there is the right or the wrong thing for that child. And that confused me so much.
Is this a taken situation? Are we being urgently pushed forward? Is there a need to save this girl, or isn't there?
Or when our protagonist finds out that her father might still be alive. It feels like that should be very cloak and daggery that she just found that out. She should sort of be sneaking around looking for more clues. She should be concerned for her safety and concerned about what her host is saying about the world around them. But she just sort of very transparently goes to where her father's being kept and immediately goes in to talk to him. And she doesn't question that either. Why is her father being held prisoner? Can she trust what this other guy is saying to her? No response that makes any logical sense. Feels very confused and contrived, and it feels like you're just kind of floating in this unknown area where there should be direction and movement, and you're not getting it. And of course, the pacing leads into characters for me. I found all the characters super confusing. I can't for the life of me figure out what our protagonist's motivation is. This leads back to me assuming
oh, she's on an exploration mission. We're going to get an exploration.
Which right away is kind of thrown in the garbage. So then I'm thinking,
okay, she's in a captive situation.
Maybe she's going to learn something about her society and something about their society. We're going to get this message. Maybe they'll work together to get her back home. And then we get the invasion and we realize there's some kind of war going on. We find out that war is actually between the first group of Keplars and the native people. Maybe we're going to just do a straight Kepler colonization narrative. But that's not really what's happening either. And the whole time, it feels like the main character's directionless. I don't know what her goal is. Was her goal to find her dad? Was her goal to find Prince Kepler? Was her goal to see that the human race continues? And if so, why isn't she immediately more dedicated to the humans that are here on Earth? The only guy whose goals seem very clear to me is the bad Kepler guy. Obviously wants all of his people to come here, and he wants to use the native Earth women to carry Kepler children. But I don't understand what the dad's motivation was. He was going along with it and then stopped. Did he realize that the native Earth people were the many? Did he realize the native Earth people were people and deserving of rights? Was it just because he got that one native Earth woman pregnant and he was concerned for the future of his son? I don't know. I don't 100% understand that one woman's goals either. I know that she doesn't want to be enslaved by the Kepler people. I know she wants her daughter free. That makes sense to me, but her indecision on whether or not to trust that woman from Kepler is confusing to me. It seems to me like she would have been best served by killing the second expedition's landing crew right away. Why are they carrying this one Kepler woman around? Were they hoping to negotiate her for one of the children that other Kepler people had stolen? Were they hoping to make some kind of impression on her so that she could talk to the other people like her and make them understand what they were doing was wrong? So they already knew that didn't really work. Her dad had stood up for them, and he's just like captured and or dead. All of these characters are very muddied, and the performances, I never get like a true emotional beat on them. And I don't know if this is because it's a German production and I'm just not reading the cues, or if it's just not fully realized. But either way, I found watching the movie to be very unsatisfying. So what do I think of The Colony as a whole? It's like an okay movie. I think what I would say is this movie is not for me, but I can see an audience for this movie and a group of people who would probably really enjoy it. It is definitely a more thoughtful science fiction. There are definitely quite a few themes that are being explored that are easy to directly relate to our world today, while like having a breeding program and forcing women to carry Kepler children has some inherent sexism layered within it. I did appreciate that all of the women were capable of fighting and holding different roles and having education, and were generally treated like equals in a lot of ways that I haven't seen in most of the science fiction movies I've seen this year. I find The Colony to be a very interesting companion piece to Dune, mostly because they both have like these breeding subplots and colonizational subplots in them, and even like a little bit of like a chosen one, special, we were waiting for you kind of element. I like that The Colony ends in a very abstracted way. I don't even know that I would call the ending of The Colony the ending. Like, it feels like nothing was resolved and no one really knows where they're going or what they're doing from here. That was kind of like realistic. Like, the people in these kind of situations are probably conflicted. So I would recommend the movie specifically to a group of audience that's into these kind of like space colonization, more thoughtful, speculative science fiction. It's kind of a downer. It's kind of like an ambiguous ending. If you're not ready for like the colonization or rich versus poor dynamic, then this might not be for you. But if those kind of things intrigue you, or if you're up for them, The Colony is kind of a short, concise journey that will give you a bunch of things you could talk to friends or family about. If you're looking for something that's like The Colony but more fun, I suggest Waterworld. And if you're looking for something that's kind of like The Colony but doesn't have the rich versus poor dynamic and it's a little more hopeful, I'd go with Wall-E. And if you're looking for something that discusses the class dynamics, has a sense of urgency and pacing, then I think The Elysium is the way you want to go. Other than that, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you want to check out other dystopian stories, you have a playlist here. And if you're looking for more sci-fi, I've got a playlist here. And if you want to be alerted to every time I release a video, I'd encourage you guys to subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment letting me know what I should watch next. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!